always, when we talk about the founders, want to come back to the debate between those who wanted to ratify the Constitution and those who were against ratification. And you're right to say that the founders, in the sense of those who were pro-ratification, people like Hamilton and Madison and Jay, the writers of the Federalist Papers, they thought, look, we're going to have George Washington. We'll use him as the model of virtue. And George Washington made good on that promise when he says in the second inaugural, I just took the oath of office. It requires me to protect the Constitution, and if I violate it, subject me to criticism and upbraidings. That really is the idea of a virtuous president. But the Anti-Federalists saw it a totally different way. They said, and it's like eerie because they predicted this exactly, what if you have not a person of virtue? What if you have a criminal president?
Yeah.
What's going to happen with the criminal president is they're going to figure out how to subvert all these checks. They turn out to be so weak. And the system isn't designed for a criminal president. So they say, Patrick Henry in particular, and I've quoted this before, but I can't, it's so relevant to what we're talking about right now, that the president is going to realize that the checks are so minimal that they'll get bolder and bolder in their power until, and this is Henry's way of putting it, Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero, turned critic and opponent of ratification of the Constitution. Still a loyalist to the United States, but against ratification. What he said is they won't hesitate to make one bold push for the American throne and crown themselves a monarch.
Welcome to another episode of The Oath and The Office. I am John Fugelsang. It has been a week of unspeakable violence and loss, and it is a very solemn occasion and a very sad week, and I am very comforted by the wisdom and warmth and humanity of my co-host, Professor Corey Brettschneider, who is, of course, a Brown University professor. And Corey, welcome. It's good to see you. I know that this horrible shooting on the Brown campus has probably affected you deeply.
Thank you, John. It is terrible. The events are unspeakable. We have two students who have been shot and murdered, and both remarkable students by all accounts. And the campus, the sense is fear. I was not on campus at the time of the shooting, but I can speak to the fact that people are reeling. It's really quite horrible. And yet at the same time, I would say that there's massive fear on the campus because as of the time that we're recording this, they still have not caught the perpetrator. There's no one in handcuffs. People are extremely fearful, but there is also at the same time a kind of resilience. Just speaking to people, some of my students, for instance, work for the newspaper, The Herald, who has been fearlessly continuing to report on what's happening. Students are banding together. They're making sure that no one's alone when they're going out at night. And at this point, I think most of the students have left campus, but while they were still there was a sense of solidarity. So it's one of the, it's unspeakable. It's not something that I could have even imagined happening on our campus. Frankly, when I've seen school shootings before, I thought, oh, that's something that happens somewhere else. And of course, that's how everyone feels until it happens at your own place.
Do we know anything at this point about what happened? It was during an economics review session. This is obviously during finals week. They have no idea yet whether this was specifically targeted against specific individuals or what the entire motive might have been.
That's right. There really is no sense. I mean, we know that what happened was that inside the room where it was an introduction to economics class, and this was a class in particular that had undergraduate teaching assistants to help with reviews and discussions of the material. And this was a review session for the final exam that was taking place in the engineering building. And the shooter came in, the undergraduate teaching assistant said that he saw the shooter look him in the eyes before opening fire. And there were also, in addition to the shootings that occurred in the room, were some evidently in the hallway outside. This is an older building on campus, the engineering building. It was an economics class, but I should say reviews, sessions like this will happen all over the campus because we need the rooms, and each department won't have enough often for its own students. So that's why it was in the engineering building, even though it was an economics class. And you know, the tragedy is unspeakable. I'll say, you know, one frustration is, well, why do we not have more information? And it turns out that building didn't have a lot of cameras in it because it's an older building on campus.
Yeah. Obviously, any violence with guns in this country is going to be politicized, as well it should be. And this is a White House that has made it a practice of putting out information on social media and then deleting it rapidly. That happened in this case as well. We've seen this before when Pam Bondi announced that 2 D.C. National Guard members were shot when it wasn't D.C. National Guard, and that had to be deleted. We've seen it with the Charlie Kirk shooting. This White House tends to put out information right away. After the Charlie Kirk shooting, Patel made premature pronouncements for the first hours. And in this case, the president said that someone was already in custody. That wound up not being correct. And then the president came out and began blame shifting. And perhaps to distract from his own mistake, was suggesting this was a failure of the university, not of the gun laws that allow lunatic males in their 20s to easily get products designed to kill lots of people really fast. It's a failure of the university. Corey, I want to ask, what does constitutional accountability actually look like to you in situations of mass violence?
You know, we have to see it through the personal lens. There's no way for me not to see it that way. But it also immediately, especially with this president, raises questions not just about law, but about what the purpose of government is. And if there's one purpose of government, it's a basic task. It's not its only one, but it's to keep people safe. And so when you hear the president of the United States saying, well, it's not my problem, it's the university's problem because they've failed to, the FBI hasn't found the person already, immediately shifting blame like that. It's like, well, he doesn't understand the basic role of the government is to provide safety. And how could somebody be so clueless? But of course, that's consistent with what we've seen. And when the FBI director, releases the name of this person in custody, even though that there wasn't reason to hold him, it turned out in the end, jumps the gun. That's also all about narcissism, about his own publicity, Kash Patel.
Exactly.
And so it's not a surprise. I would have loved to have think that in a crisis like this, where a university is attacked senselessly, violence of young adults, 2 murders, that the president would step forward and rise above it, and the FBI director would do the same. But we've seen the opposite of that, and we've seen the cluelessness to not understand the role of the federal government is to protect us.
Well, standing up and handling it is what men would do, and the president and director of the FBI are not what we call men. But blaming institutions, right? That's a great way of avoiding the more inconvenient national conversation about gun violence in this country and why other people around the world are looking at us in shock that we keep allowing this to happen. But just to put this to bed, from your perspective, Professor, what is the responsibility of a university, and where does that responsibility end?
Look, I don't think anybody at Brown would, I know that no one at Brown would disagree with the fact that we've got to really take a serious look at our security. And that's exactly what's going on as the emails come out. We receive probably 3 emails a day from the university detailing both the investigation but also what's being done. And yes, there is a comprehensive look at the security at Brown. For instance, shouldn't you have to use a key card in order to enter the buildings? We were told that the building was open because it was final exam period. Well, that's something that probably has to be looked at, as generally the security needs to be looked at. I mean, I will say that I know a lot of the, we have our own police department on campus. These are extremely dedicated people, and the people who work at Brown love the university as I do. So, there's no individual fault here, but at the same time, the university will look at the way that we provide security. But I can't emphasize this enough. That's not to say that the FBI, the national government, that after all, a huge portion of our tax dollars go to funding this agency that is supposed to protect us, it can't abdicate that responsibility because the president's decided that he's frustrated with the investigation and wants to blame a specific institution that doesn't have anything like the manpower and resource power to conduct a national, high-level search for
Yeah.
what is a threat not just to Brown, but to everyone. I mean, this is somebody we don't know what the motive was, but clearly unhinged and dangerous.
Well, let me ask the big question that we've never discussed before, Corey, but it's never hit this close to home for you as a professor. This country has normalized mass shootings in ways that all other first world democracies simply have not. And I want to get your take on it. I mean, why? Why? How should we respond to claims that nothing can be done?
I just think it's false. I mean, there are things that can be done to prevent this, and one very instructive thing to do is to look at the comparative cases. Now, of course, there was also, around the same time as the terrible events at Brown, a tragic anti-Semitic attack and killings in Australia.
That's right.
But when you look at the response of Australia, first of all, in a previous mass shooting, legislation was passed pretty quickly. And when you look at the
1990, I'm sorry, 1996. I want to point that out. 1996 we're talking about. Go ahead.
And when you look at the graphs of what followed in 1996, it was a massive reduction in gun deaths. We haven't seen anything like that in the United States, and gun deaths continue to happen. This isn't the only killing this year. It isn't unusual. Unfortunately, it is normal. It's never happened at Brown before, but it's happened around the country. And the false sense of security that it can't happen to me, that I was admitting that I had, is just not right. But when you look at Australia, it shows you restrictions on guns, gun control really does work. Look at New Zealand, similarly. Now, there's a reason why they can act so quickly in those two countries, and that's because they're parliamentary democracies that have just a lot less of the slowness that we have in legislation. But that's not to say that we can't act eventually. There is pressure, I think, in those systems. There's a flexibility that allows for rapid action. We're not going to get gun control legislation without a change in the House and the Senate, but we do have an election coming up. And it's not going to happen immediately, this legislation, but it can happen. We can have serious gun control in this country, and that's what I think partly this election has to be about. Again, returning to the issue of basic safety and whether or not the government can provide it.
I mean, if we want it, if we have the will, if we're pro-life, if we're patriotic, if we care about the lives of other Americans, we can do this. We've seen it before. Government policies have gotten us into messes. Government policies have gotten us out of messes. Other countries have the same mental illness, the same violent video games, the same SSRIs. They do not have access for emotionally unstable 20-something males to products designed to kill lots of people really fast. And we're already hearing the right wing, overwhelmingly described as Christian, pro-gun proliferation folk out there who are saying, well, this goes and proves that Australia, the gun control doesn't work. See, gun control doesn't work. Now, 1996, they passed this law, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Almost 30 years. That you can still get guns in Australia, but they have 12 times the population. Our country has 12 times the population of Australia, and we have 580 times the number of annual gun murders. What do you say to these nabobs who say that strict gun laws don't stop violence altogether? Why should we even try? It seems like it's just a rhetorical trap to stop any progress. And I keep thinking, these people, you know how they hated gay people until their nephew came out? I fear, Corey, that we're in a society where it's going to be 1 degree of empathy. And every one of these Republicans is going to need to have someone they love get shot before they care about reducing these stats.
Yeah, I think it's, part of the problem with this specific policy issue is that people rely on anecdotes. And so, of course, a lot of anti-gun control forces on the right are willing to say, oh, look, it happened in Australia, gun control legislation doesn't work. But that's not how empirical analysis of policy is supposed to work. You look on the whole, not at the specific examples. And the truth is, they have seen, after the 1996 shooting, a massive reduction in attacks and gun deaths. Now, they're looking at more restrictive legislation, and the fact that they have some of the most restrictive legislation in the world hasn't done the trick. And so they look at the data, they say these laws work, let's do more, not less. In the United States, things get so politicized so quickly. Of course, I'd be remiss to not mention that that so many on the right were very quick to point out that this somehow was an attack on conservative students, because unfortunately one of the students was a member of the Young Republicans, and they
That's right.
omitted the fact that the other student was a Muslim student, and the idea that this is a political attack based on ideology has no founding in fact, and from anything that we've seen so far. So it's just a sickness of our society and our system that we're willing to politicize this in as quick a way as we can, especially, well, frankly, those on the Trump side of things, to say that, Australia's evidence gun control doesn't work. This is like Charlie Kirk's death, an attack on the right, and none of that is based in reality. We've got to return to a sane politics that's based on data, that's based on safety, that's based on shared values. And the leadership failure that we're seeing at the top is really, one of the worst things about it. Of course, the absolute worst thing is the deaths themselves and the attacks and those in the hospital. But watching a president just degrade himself and degrade all of us with this rhetoric has been a horrific part of it.
Just the unspeakable atrocity of indifference. And I should point out this Australia shooting. This was truly an anti-Semitic attack. We've sort of gotten inured in the last couple of years to anything that criticizes the civilian government of Israel being called anti-Semitism, which I think is very, very dangerous and distracts us from the real, true hatred of our Jewish brothers and sisters that's out there. And I got to say, it was a Muslim man who was one of the heroes of this occasion, and that is a very, very narrow silver lining. He's already raised $1 million for his recovery in the hospital. But, Corey, in the light of all this, Australia came out and they said they're going to pass more gun laws to try to make sure this doesn't happen, and they have a constitution where they can do that right away. Over here, we already know. Nothing moves. Barack Obama tried to have expanded background checks, 90% public support, and he could not even get an up or down vote in the Senate. I want to tug on your coat before the break about Heller, the landmark 2008 case, Columbia versus Heller, where Justice Antonin Scalia, the patron saint of all of these right-wing guys, wrote the majority opinion where he said, yes, that you have a right to bear arms for self-defense, but said the right is not limited and is compatible with long-standing gun regulations. Scalia said that the Second Amendment doesn't pose a problem for lawful regulations that have historical support. So, I mean, why is this so hard? Constitutionally speaking, Scalia himself says meaningful gun regulation is compatible with the Second Amendment as it's actually written.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a critic of the Heller decision. I think that the right understanding of the Second Amendment is that it's a dead letter, that the Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia, and everything that follows from it is about well-regulated militias, which are an institution of the 18th century that don't exist anymore. They were a way of allowing for civilians in the absence of a standing army to come together in order to provide defense of the nation. Well, that's not a thing anymore now that we have a standing army. So to my mind, and this was the law until the Heller case, that the Second Amendment is not really about individual rights. Now, the Heller case changed that. It made, Scalia said, well, that preface, as he put it, that prefatory clause is irrelevant to the fact that there's still a right to gun ownership for individuals. Now, I disagree with it, but even Scalia, and I'm just now adding and enhancing what you said, John.
Please.
Even Scalia pointed out that, it does say well-regulated. And so if you think that clause matters, then the kind of right that there is one compatible with regulation. So the idea that this is some sort of absolute right in the Second Amendment, even if you're a conservative, is just wrong. So there is no constitutional bar on doing something. Taking away all guns, yes, I think that the Supreme Court certainly would not allow that.
Which nobody's called for.
But nobody's calling for that, absolutely. And, in the absence of that, any sensible regulation is not just, and let me just emphasize this, I have a piece in The Guardian that we can link to on the Substack, that it's not just that it's allowable under the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, to the degree that it says anything about gun regulation, it calls for regulation, because even when it came to these militias, they were worried enough about guns that they wanted them regulated. So if there's anything that survives of that preface, well regulated, that means we've got an obligation to do something. The piece that I'm talking about in The Guardian that I had talked about the Stoneman Douglas activists that came after that shooting, and who really, to my mind, are the true defenders of the Second Amendment. If you want to take that seriously, the idea of well-regulated, then that's what they were calling for, not the abolition of all guns. And, I will say something on a sort of hopeful note. This is an unspeakable tragedy, but, I want to shine a light on why Brown is a special place. We look for our students in admissions who are self-motivated, who are sincere about beliefs, about public policy, about the public good. And what I believe you're going to get is 5,000 kids, students, young adults, who as they grow, after they've handled the aftermath of this tragedy, are going to turn into activists who are going to demand regulation. And I don't think all of them are going to be from the progressive wing of Brown's campus. I think they're going to come from all the wing, because when you see this firsthand, you're not going to stand for it. And when you know that something could be done, you're going to do something about it. So these are talented, motivated people who I think, like we've seen before from the Parkland shooting, from Stoneman Douglas, are really going to step forward and do something. So I take heart in that.
I do too. I mean, the majority is with us. The majority wants this to be reduced. The majority knows that we can have an America where you can tackle a guy when he has to reload mid-massacre after 10 rounds. It's not that hard to do, and we can achieve it if we have the will and if we're pro-life enough and patriotic enough to care about our fellow Americans. At this point, Corey, I'm already defending Scalia on this show. It's that bad. So I'm going to really need to have some laughs about Susie Wiles setting the entire White House on fire in a unspeakably candid interview with Vanity Fair. But we'll get to that later on. Quick break. We'll be right back in a moment. This is The Oath and the Office. Break from violence and talk about the violence being done to the separation of church and state. This new legal challenge in Tennessee, it seems, is about to revive the question of religious charter schools and how they want so badly to make public funds go to private religions that you can hear the founders screaming from their crypts. Corey, tell us a bit about this case in Tennessee and why it's such a big deal.
Well, we had a case some months ago about the question of whether or not there was a free exercise. The Constitution has two religion clauses. One guaranteed the free exercise of religion, the other banning the establishment of an official church or laws respecting an establishment of religion related to the establishment of religion. And the argument that the court is going to consider again, it already considered it once, and I'll talk about what happened, but the court is going to consider the question of whether or not there's a violation of that free exercise clause when it comes to denying religious public schools the ability to exist. So there are, of course, these charter schools that involve choice of students, but that are public. And the lawsuit says denying the ability to create a religious public school is a violation of the free exercise clause. Now, why is that? They're saying that it's a kind of discrimination, that what a charter school does is it creates a variety of different choices, and if you're saying one of those choices can't be a religious one, then we're not going to allow it. And what happened the last time the court, a few months ago, considered this is Justice Barrett recused herself because
I was going to ask about that. Yeah, that's we ended up in a deadlock because she recused herself. So I mean,
4-4.
Yeah,
and she's been basically so involved in the issue, and turns out was a close friend of one of the litigators, and that friendship, I think, led her to. We don't know the reason for her recusal, but that's my sense that she stepped down because of her friendship with this litigator. I don't think she would recuse herself just because she has strong feelings on the issue. Justices have strong feelings on all sorts of issues. So that led me at the time when we covered it before, back in the spring, to suggest that this isn't the end of it, that we're going to see another case, that this will be teed up again, the court will take it, and likely this time she won't back down, that she won't recuse herself. And I am very confident that her vote will be to say that, yes, there is religious discrimination involved when you deny the existence of a religious charter school. And so I think we're going to have new law on this subject, 5-4 decision this time, and we'll cover it as it comes up.
I mean, you know how I feel about this, Professor. I wrote a book about it. These fundamentalist Christians do not care a damn about the Bible or the things Jesus talked about. They care about conservative Christian power. That is their goal. That's what all of this is about. It's not about using the teachings of Christ to make the kids better people. It's all about Christianity having more, their version of Christianity, having more power. It's everything the founders warned us against. Their narrow right-wing version of the gospel, and having that be administered in our government. Are we seeing a shift from religious freedom from government to religious entitlement to government funding? It really seems like the deck has been stacked enough to begin to make that undoing of the Constitution happen.
I love that way of putting it, and of course, your last book, and I know you're thinking about this for the next one too, is about that. And there couldn't be a more important issue, because I think the framers rightly did worry about, and I'm going to go back to the Constitution and its language, because it really helps us to navigate here to see what's wrong with this reasoning. I tried to lay out why the justices think this is a free exercise violation, but what it does is it really eviscerates, if they do this, the most important part of the religion clauses, and that's the Establishment Clause. And the framers themselves emphasized this idea that not only would we not have an official religion, but that we wouldn't have laws that related to or were like laws that you would have if there was an official religion. And what is a religious public school after all but saying that government can endorse and teach some religions as true and others as not true? And that's my worry, that once you open the door to religious charter schools, there's no careful distinction between, say, secular subjects and religious
That's
subjects.
the thing,
you might
right?
get into teaching religion as true, and that's not what a pluralistic, a multi-racial, multi-religious society is like. And let me just say one more thing about this. The whole idea that we're not an institution, not a nation that embraces one religion. Its school system, a nation's school system, is how we impart what we are. The court had so carefully distinguished between the kind of funding for religion that we might allow, and it was subtle about this in a case called Lemon. It said, for instance, look, it's fine to give funding to religious schools for secular subjects, for math, for reading. And in fact, my mom, I'll mention my mom, who listens to the podcast, by the way, worked for a long time as a guidance counselor in a Catholic school. Now, they distinguished the separation of church and state by having her in a van across the street from the school, but they still were providing services to the students. These were careful ways of working out the difference between saying we have an official religion and that we can fund secular subjects or services for students.
Yep.
And that's all being wiped out by saying, yes, we can now have religious schools. Once you do that, I don't really know what the limit is on having an official religion.
And again,
in fact, Justice Thomas, to just go, we'll talk about him later too, but to show you how radical direction things can go. Justice Thomas thinks you can have official state religions, and he looks at the founding, he says there would be no problem with the state of New York saying that we're Presbyterian or declaring an official religion, and that really is a violation of the framers' idea.
It's madness, and as scary as it is to think about a talking snake being taught in science class, what really makes me the most upset about all this is a big chunk of this, I've come to believe, is about teaching girls the biblical roles of girls and womanhood, and I think that's driving a whole lot of this too. Corey, obviously,
and calling it religious freedom, that's the worst part. It's
exactly.
Violating the values of a pluralistic society, and at the same time falsely claiming it's freedom. And that's where we're headed.
The question we always have to ask whenever this debate comes up, and I'm sorry to bring it up again, but how would religious charter schools funded by taxpayer dollars affect students of different faiths or no faith at all? I'm already hung up on the fact that this whole charter school scam is designed to make poor kids fall through the cracks and turn the public school system into a place for the poor kids to go. I mean, this is just bringing back segregation in so many ways, but what about the actual kids? What about kids who weren't Christian, weren't religious, or weren't the conservative Christian, which of course does not focus on the teachings of Jesus, just focuses on power? I mean, what about those kids?
Well, I think you've got to, what they would say, the defenders of the system, is it's about choice. And what a charter school does, they're not private schools, they're public schools, so they're free. And you don't want your kid to go to that school, then they can go somewhere else. But so much of this comes down to where you live. And so say that the one school that's high quality in your area is a religious Catholic school, for example. If that's the only choice that you have, well, you might wind up making that sacrifice, even though those aren't your beliefs. And then all of a sudden, you've traded for the educational value of your kid,
Yeah.
the values of your family, and now all of a sudden you're being taught this totally different set of values, and and the idea too. I will tell you. I mean, I think I've shared this before, but when I was a graduate student, I was part of a group that would often have host prominent conservatives, and I loved it because I got to sit there in these conversations. But I won't forget, and I won't reveal enough to know who this is, but in this one of these conversations, there was a federal judge who talked about the idea that she didn't really get why the liberals like me, frankly, were so upset about religion in schools and Christianity in particular, because in her kids' school there was a Christmas pageant and all the Jewish kids loved it. And it was like, well, I just think it's just not showing the idea that, and I'm going to go back to the founding because you mentioned it, that George Washington, in his letter to the Newport congregation, Jewish congregation in Newport, the Toros Synagogue, he talked about the fact, it's such an incredible letter, that you were asking, is there going to be an official religion in the United States? The congregation wrote to him to ask that question. He writes this incredible letter back that says, not only is there not going to be an official religion, but I reject the idea of mere toleration. Those are the words that he used. That I'm not going to think about religion as, Judaism, for instance, as just a tolerated religion. It's going to be equal with all religions. And how are we going to ensure that? The idea of equality comes from the ban on establishment. So, that's what this story doesn't get. The idea that, the Jewish kids were happy to see, this other religion highlighted on stage. Not, by the way, in a pluralistic display, but in one that prioritized one religion above others. No, that is a violation of the basic idea that we are equals in this society regardless of our religion, and that take it from no better authority than George Washington.
I want to shift gears a bit, keep it on the Supreme Court for a story that's quite disturbing, and that is about racial discrimination in jury selection for death penalty cases, which obviously is a problem that has always existed, but right now the Supreme Court in the Pitchford case is reviewing this. It alleges racial bias in the jury selection in a death penalty trial. Corey, why does this case matter? I'm actually surprised in 2025 that we're still seeing cases like this make it up to the court. It encourages, it warms my heart to know that enough people care.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're so often talking about destruction of the Constitution on this podcast. And the first part of our podcast was about horrific events in which the apparatus of government is failing to respond entirely when it comes to gun control. And the religious charter school argument, to my mind, is a very worrying development. But here's a good thing, which is that there's a case called Batson that prohibits discrimination based on race in jury selection, and especially in death penalty cases, that you can't have a prosecutor who's trying to exclude black jurors, for instance, in the hope of getting a conviction. And there's a prosecutor who, in an earlier case, did just that, and the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, made very clear that Batson is still the law, that we're not going to allow exclusion of jurors based on race so that you can get a conviction, especially black jurors, to ensure an all-white jury, that period of America is over. Now, at the same time that I want to highlight that it looks like the court has another one of these cases, that they have the votes to continue this extremely sensible, basic requirement of civil rights. Justice Thomas has spoken out about this in a way that I just think it's important to highlight because you see how bad things have gotten. He says, well, I understand why the court is applying Batson, but Batson's wrong. And in a color-blind society, what we need to do, and this is, of course, one of his main views, colorblindness, is not look at whether or not there's discrimination. I mean, it's just baffling.
Really color blindness is for people who can't bring themselves to be color conscious, Corey, as we have learned. I mean,
I have to say too, it just shows how this language of color blindness really is a way of saying we don't believe in anti-discrimination legislation.
Exactly.
How can you not take race into account?
Exactly.
If you're trying to stop discrimination, that's how you do it.
But doesn't racial discrimination in jury selection undermine the legitimacy of the entire justice system?
Yeah, I mean, how could you claim that you have an impartial system if you are trying to stack it with people based on race in a way to ensure conviction? It's almost the definition of what the apartheid society of the
Ding,
19th
ding.
and 20th century was. The fact that so many false convictions happened because of just this, excluding black jurors, making sure it was an all-white jury with black defendants, and that's what Thomas evidently wants to bring us back to. I mean, his color blindness, I could sort of understand the argument, although I vehemently disagree with it in areas like affirmative action. But when you get to the core idea of discrimination, that you're not supposed to take race into account, you show how misguided he is. And, I don't know what motivates this person. There are all sorts of speculation, but, worry about being condescended to. But this is the core of anti-discrimination that he's now challenging. I mean, the 1964 Civil Rights Act bans discrimination based on race, bans segregation. I imagine that on those things, as radical as he sounds, he thinks that legislation is misguided too.
But let's be honest here. I mean, you know me, death penalty is my biggest issue, and to me, it's inherently shows that a death penalty system that historically, for decade after decade, shows racial bias. How can this system ever be considered just? Right? Like, it's already unjust. I already think our system is invalid because we kill people. We murder our prisoners. We're the only advanced country in the first world that still murders our prisoners. What does it say about American democracy, Professor, that these cases keep popping up? I mean, by the way, this is not the first time the same prosecutor has been accused of removing black jurors. So at what point does a pattern become constitutional evidence?
There's one of the most important lines, I think, in the history of the death penalty, and I'm going to say something about the history in which one of the justices says, I will no longer tinker with the machinery of death.
Harry Blackmun
Says it. Great.
I remember.
And to my mind, it's such a profound moment because the court's history is that in Furman versus Georgia in the 1970s, they do say that the Eighth Amendment bans the death penalty, that the idea of cruel and unusual punishment can't be made compatible with the death penalty. And they do that for several different reasons. One is they say racial discrimination, that's the main opinion, is so endemic into the system, it can't be overcome. And that's what we're talking about now. We're seeing that here. And, banning a jury that's all white is one thing, but it shows you that this is just one part of a deeply discriminatory system. Another issue that's raised is innocence, that you can't undo the conviction and killing of an innocent person, although there are many instances in which this has happened. So the irrevocability is a problem. But the main opinion by Justices Marshall and Brennan that I tend to turn to, it's a concurring opinion, but it was the one that I wish would have stayed on, says that, there's something about the dignity of human beings that's being revoked. And a government doesn't have the ability, it's not within the government's power to take life and to violate that basic human dignity. Now, the follow-up to this in a case called Gregg versus Georgia, the court said the opposite of this Blackmun quote. They did allow for the tinkering with the machinery of death. And as the states started to come up with methods of, for instance, bifurcating juries, having the guilt phase different from the second phase of figuring out whether or not death would be a punishment or not, the court loosened up and allowed it. And so we're back to tinkering with the machinery of death, and I couldn't agree more. That is a total mistake.
And I should put in here, just for my preachy moment, that these people who are fighting for this identify as Christian. And I'm sorry, but the hypocrisy has to be mentioned. Jesus, if you believe this book they wave around, overwhelmingly opposes murdering prisoners or sinners, even the ones who deserve it. If you believe this book, he overturns retributive justice as a concept in the Sermon on the Mount. He stops an execution, says only sinless people are allowed to execute. I mean, time and time again, he opposes the idea of murdering bad people who are prisoners. And I just wish that at some point the media and the court system could begin using the hypocrisy argument. Because again, these folks, they keep saying they want conservative Christian values. They don't want the values of Christ. And that is why what they're trying to do to our government in every level is so insidious. Because they're not really trying to push Christianity on us. They're trying to push their version of it. And that's what's destructive.
And like all our conversations, John, one of the great things that I think we're doing is we're having a conversation on a constitutional level, on a legal level, on a policy level, And then we're bringing in questions of faith and belief. And I think, too, one of the allies in this fight might be the new Pope, who has been saying what you've been saying, and will start to highlight this issue in a way that might
I hope so.
get American back on the agenda. It's not immediately in the future that the Congress is going to ban the death penalty, but it
I
might
know
be,
that. I
might
mean,
be
I
in the
don't.
long run.
I don't see it coming anytime in my lifetime. But again, this is something that Jesus is unambiguous about. And to the Vatican's credit, I will call them out all day, Corey, you know, on hypocrisy and gender injustice and the homophobia and the sex hang-ups and the looting and the pillage. I could go on. But when it comes to this, they're right on. So we have a lot more to cover on the oath in the office. Please do stick around. When we come back, I want to talk about Lindsay Halligan, who, boy, I wish Trump could just quit her. And, of course, Susie Wiles has set the White House on fire. And it looks like she didn't mean to. Or maybe she did, and the White House Chief of Staff is already putting space between herself and this parade of mediocrity. Don't go away. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. It's so good to have you with us. Professor Corey Brettschneider, wow. Can we talk about Lindsay Halligan just a little bit? Because Trump is now pushing this bid to get the Senate to confirm her as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. In November, a federal judge said her appointment as the top prosecutor was totally invalid, and that is why the Letitia James case was dismissed, why the James Comey case was dismissed. As we've talked to you many times, I think the greatest grace given to America is that when it comes to our fascists, they tend to be more dumb than evil, and all these preventable problems. But I want to ask you about Lindsay Halligan, because she does fit the Trump profile of why he'd want to have someone like her for a lawyer. She's hot, amoral, and obedient to him, which seems to be the three things he looks for in a woman. But this is, at the heart of this is what they call the blue slip tradition, right? The century-old practice where they're going to try to get her in there anyway. What does this tell us about how the Senate is supposed to act as a check on presidential power? Because I kind of feel like they're going to be teaching Lindsay Halligan in law school for a long time, and maybe that will be her great gift to jurisprudence.
Yeah, it is somebody who is not qualified, obviously, and was not legally appointed. And just to remind listeners, we covered the Letitia James and Comey indictments and the court's smart move of saying these indictments aren't valid because the prosecutor isn't lawfully appointed. They tried to have her as an interim appointment, although she didn't meet the criteria. So now Trump has swallowed the pain and seen that this isn't going to work, just sticking her in there, that we have a check which requires confirmation by the Senate. And he's going to try to get her through. So that's a constitutional lesson that's important. This blue slip tradition, can be, we talked about the problems with our system of government, and I'll put the Senate there too, that one of the problems is that it slows things down. And so when you see Australia and New Zealand zip through gun legislation, gun control legislation, it's because they have a parliamentary system. It doesn't have the slow gears of policy that a presidential system like ours does. But there are good things about it, especially when you have a president who is wanting to attack the rule of law and democracy. One is the requirement of the confirmation process, but the other is the blue slip process, which can be pernicious in the hands of those who want to see block appointments that are progressive, say, in states that are not, and it gives senators a lot of power. But here it's protecting the basics of the rule of law. It's protecting against an appointment of somebody who really is not qualified. And both the requirement of Senate confirmation and the blue slip process, which...
So I understand how the blue slip is supposed to be how the Senate should act as a check on presidential power. And as you mentioned, Lindsay Halligan has no prior prosecutorial experience. She was Trump's personal attorney. That's very unusual, right, for a U.S. attorney nominee? I mean, this seems to be a textbook case about the independence of federal prosecutors. Criminal cases against Trump's political adversaries were dismissed because of her involvement, as I mentioned, Comey and James. So what does this reveal about the risks of politicizing the Justice Department in the first place? I mean, why does it matter for public faith in the rule of law? If you're going to try and corrupt the Justice Department, maybe get competent, corrupt people to do it for you.
Well, I think that maybe is one of the good things to learn about all of this, that there aren't a lot of competent and corrupt people. The Justice Department has a long history, especially after the Nixon administration, of prioritizing integrity. And you have people who It's seen for law students, for instance, to get into the Department of Justice honors program, to be a U.S. attorney. People like Preet Bharara, who
Right.
I've had the honor of being on his podcast. He'll be on with us soon.
Can't wait.
These are people who are at the highest level of the legal profession and exhibit integrity. And yet we have a president who's figured out that if you have people like that in power, they're not going to do things like indict his political opponents. So he looks for loyalists over all things.
That's it.
And now what's the check on that? Well, we're seeing in real time what the check is. It's the Senate, the confirmation requirement, and the limit on using interim appointments, which don't require confirmation. And it turns out it's also, hopefully, this blue slip process, which requires essentially the sign-off of senators from the state in question, in which the U.S. attorney will be appointed.
So if Trump is arguing that blue slips are a scam because they block his ability to govern, I mean, I think he's pretty much saying it's not really about efficiency. It's about getting rid of the guardrails that prevent him and future presidents from installing dopey loyalists in prosecutorial roles.
I couldn't have said it better, John. That's a great way to put it. Everything is dumb and stupid if it means blocking his power, because this is, and we've been consistently saying this since we started this podcast, this is his attempt to destroy the Senate, to destroy the courts, to destroy the independent civil servants who would check what he wants to do, and to install an authoritarian monarchy or dictatorship. That's really what he cares about. And so every time he sees the system stopping him, he says it's stupid, because that's what he's all about, is his own power. Now, when we first met and I wrote my piece, Trump versus the Constitution, I thought it was obvious that he'd learned that lesson very quickly, because, the Constitution, if he were to win, that the Constitution is above any person. Well, in real time, we're seeing that that's not obvious, that the President Trump often is defeating the Constitution, but he's not winning in every case, and this is one of them which he's clearly not winning, thankfully. Susie Wiles, not to jump ahead, but admitted that she's been trying to stop him on his retribution campaign, his revenge campaign against Letitia James and against Comey. Actually, I should say she distinguished between them. Letitia James, she said she understood. Comey, she was not happy with in the interview, but the bottom line is you have a president who's using the office not to do what he's supposed to do, but to take it out, to take revenge out on political opponents. You can't do that if you have the tradition of integrity in the Department of Justice. You have to subvert it. And thankfully, the blue slip process confirmation, that looks like it's throwing a wrench in his plans.
Well, you brought up Susie Wiles, so let's finally go there. A feel-good story about a deeply feel-bad experience. With all of this violence and loss and death this week, I want to thank Susie Wiles for making me laugh today. We've talked about the White House Chief of Staff, and I've shared with you my puzzlement about her, Professor. What is her role? She seems like the adult in the room that Trump surrounded himself with in the first term. Now she seems like the only, of course, in the first term he only had adult film stars in the room. But now I've thought Susie Wiles is, I guess her job is keeping this on the tracks, and I don't know if she's doing a great job or a bad job, but she gave a series of interviews to Vanity Fair, and wow, I hope this lady talks a lot. I want to hear her. I mean, like, we're gonna see quotes from Vanity Fair in future court cases. I'm pretty much convinced. But to your point, Professor, she openly acknowledges that Trump is pursuing criminal prosecutions out of a desire for revenge. So let's start with that. From a constitutional perspective, where is the bright line to you between lawful authority of the executive and unconstitutional abuse of power when prosecutions are motivated by petty personal vengeance?
Look, the point of the job, and it's outlined in the oath of office, that's why the podcast is called The Oath in the Office, is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, to protect the rule of law. And the opposite of that is somebody who uses the office for their own personal grievances. So let's take the two cases, just to come back to them.
Yeah, please.
In which he is relentlessly pursuing prosecution. One is, which Susie Wiles did say was a bad thing to do, was against James Comey. And she essentially said, look, he's only was doing his job, and all the things that Trump is upset with him, have to do with his role. So, but the thing that really got me that was so strange is she said, one thing was she would let him do it for 90 days, and then after pursue revenge. But
right.
Made an exception for Letitia James. And just to remind you, Letitia James won I think it was a $500 million verdict
Correct.
against the Trump organizations.
And she made, and Letitia James got all of us to feel sorry for banks, the IRS, and insurance companies, because Trump was ripping them all off, and it's not easy to make people care about those three entities. I'm sorry, Professor, go on.
So there, Susie Wiles is like, well, I understand she got $500 million of his own money. Letitia James didn't get the $500 million. The state of New York was supposed to get it. And actually, the number was adjusted subsequently lower, even though the liability stood. But so there's just sort of a weird misunderstanding in the way, she has some basic idea that this isn't okay to seek revenge, but the 90-day exception and the Letitia James exception tell me this isn't somebody who's all there. It's somebody who is got some conscience, but it's like she has a quarter of a conscience or something like that.
Yeah, or I don't even know if she has a conscience or if she knows the way this movie ends, which, as I've said many times, this movie ends like the last scene of Scarface. And I think, I got the impression that this was a chief of staff really starting to put serious distance between herself and the malfeasance she's propped up. I mean, as you said, she described trying and failing to get Trump to stop his score settling, as she called it, after 90 days. The fact that she would say that, to me, it tells us that this is not incidental revenge. This is ongoing retaliation. He's not going to stop. What does the Constitution, Corey, I'm trying to frame this right, what does the Constitution assume about presidential character and restraint or just basic human decency? And what happens when those assumptions break down? I mean, it is possible that the founders could never have imagined a oligarch, millionaire at birth, racist narcissist with decades of untreated syphilis in his brain. I mean, what does the Constitution assume anything about presidential restraint? And if those assumptions break down, we're just stuck with a dictatorship the founders couldn't have predicted.
I mean, I always, when we talk about the founders, want to come back to the debate between those who wanted to ratify the Constitution and those who were against ratification. And you're right to say that the founders, in the sense of those who were pro-ratification, people like Hamilton and Madison and Jay, the writers of the Federalist Papers, they thought, look, we're going to have George Washington. We'll use him as the model of virtue. And George Washington made good on that promise when he says in the second inaugural, I just took the oath of office. It requires me to protect the Constitution. And if I violate it, subject me to criticism and upbraidings. That really is the idea of a virtuous president. But the Anti-Federalists saw it a totally different way. They said, and it's like eerie because they predicted this exactly, what if you have not a person of virtue? What if you have a criminal president?
Yeah.
What's going to happen with the criminal president is they're going to figure out how to subvert all these checks. They turn out to be so weak. And the system isn't designed for a criminal president. So they say, Patrick Henry in particular, and I've quoted this before, but I can't, it's so relevant to what we're talking about right now, that the president is going to realize that the checks are so minimal that they'll get bolder and bolder in their power until, and this is Henry's way of putting it, Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero, turned critic and opponent of ratification of the Constitution. Still a loyalist to the United States, but against ratification. What he said is they won't hesitate to make one bold push for the American throne and crown themselves a monarch. That's pretty much an exact quote. And what do you have here? Well, where's the check coming from? The chief of staff, which is not a constitutional role, is saying, hey, you're not supposed to do that? That's where the check is supposed to be. It's not working, and even this check within the president's staff is like sometimes, I understand what you're doing when it comes to Letitia James. It's not a real check at all. Why she's doing it, the motivation question, is an interesting one. Christopher Whipple wrote this pretty important book about chiefs of staff, so she might be trying to prop herself up in history. That might be one thing.
I think so, very much.
Her reputation.
Very much. Ding, ding, ding.
Or she's just sloppy as she started to talk about all this. And
those two things can be true, Professor. Yeah. Those two things can be true at once. She can be selfish and sloppy, sort of a prerequisite for this administration. But again, for those who haven't read the Vanity Fair article, I encourage you to read it because it's full of great gossipy stuff. Corey and I just have to talk about the legal angle. But I mean, she read the Epstein documents. She acknowledges Trump's name's there. She said she told Trump not to pardon the violent January 6th terrorists, and he ignored her. She said there's no evidence that Clinton was ever on Epstein's private island, which is essentially calling her boss a liar. She says that Trump has an alcoholic's personality. She said that J.D. Vance was a conspiracy theorist for a decade, and he only became pro-Trump because he's ambitious. I mean, she's telling a lot of truths here. Elon Musk is an avowed ketamine user. Russell Vogt is a right-wing absolute zealous. She defended USAID, saying they do very good work. I mean, this lady did a lot of truth-telling here, Corey. I'm kind of astonished. But what got me is that she makes it very clear. She doesn't see her job as constraining the president, but she sees her job as facilitating his desires. Whatever petty whim Man-Baby wants, even if she thinks he goes too far, it's her job to give Man-Baby what he wants. This is a dumb question, but let me ask it anyway. In our system, Corey, who's supposed to restrain a president inclined towards retribution and madness? It's not the advisors. It's the DOJ, Congress, and the courts, right?
My mom always told me there are no dumb questions, and in this case, this is certainly not a dumb question. It's a profound one to ask about that, and I think it helps to show, the way that all of this cashes out, this debate between anti-federalists and federalists, that there is no design in the Constitution for a chief of staff to be constraining a president. It's
right.
Just part of the executive branch. And that's what you're seeing from her, although she's had claims to have some pushback, and this does look like an attempt to cover
She's
herself.
a henchman. She's another henchman.
Just enabling him again and again. And she's still there, by the way. She hasn't been fired or resigned.
Not yet. It's early, but yeah, we'll see.
So the constitutional checks that we do have, though, sometimes work. And just to kind of review the whole discussion that we've had, it includes confirmation by the Senate of U.S. attorneys and other principal officers of the United States. It includes even informally the blue slip process, which reflects the idea of a separate branch of government having control over these appointments. But there are some offices that are subservient to the president, like the chief of staff. Now, here's, I think, what's profound in your question to open it up.
Please.
Remember, what Trump is trying to do is to subvert all of those checks, to undo them under this theory of the so-called unitary executive. He wants to make everybody, like his chief of staff, totally subject to his whims, and that includes judges, it includes Congress, and you know what? The jury's still out on whether or not he's going to succeed.
So let me wrap this one up because I want to get off of Susie Wiles, but I mean, she summarized Donald Trump's whole mindset as he believes there's nothing he can't do. Okay, and I think that's right. He has been spoiled since a child. He was not raised by parents who knew how to say no. From your work in constitutional democracy, Professor, is that belief itself a constitutional crisis? I mean, like, if he really does believe there's nothing he can't do, like, that's a fact, right? Could that be a constitutional crisis, a person's belief? And what mechanisms would exist to correct a president who sees no limits on his power and only his?
I was thinking about that as I read both read the account of Susie Wiles' interview, because it really reveals it's an inside look about our worst fears about what's going on. You see how, of course, it's revenge that's motivating things, that he's bringing people on board who he thinks of as allies, even if they're using ketamine in the case of Musk. And it shows a kind of pathology that the anti-federalists were worried about, and turns out rightly, which is that it would not be a crisis if it was the belief of just some real estate developer. But this is the belief of the President of the United States with this massive amount of power. And although we have these supposed checks on that power, are they going to hold? Are the anti-federalists going to be right? And when you have somebody who's motivated exactly as Patrick Henry worried about, with not only narcissism but with monarchical ambitions,
exactly,
will the checks hold? They might not, and that's why absolutely it is a crisis to have somebody in power with these horrific beliefs.
Wow, it's so much fun to live through a crisis that'll be taught in law schools for 100 years. Corey, it is time now for some viewer mail, if you're ready. JD from Wisconsin asks, in the October 8th podcast, you and Fugelsang spoke about how, with the exception of Trump, everyone else who has violated our Constitution and laws can be prosecuted. My question is, by whom? Thanks for all you do.
Well, I think that's a great question, JD, and it goes to the heart of the question of how much control the president has over the Department of Justice. I think the reality is that we won't see prosecutions of Trump's allies in this term from the federal government. That if we do see them, it'll likely be because in the next administration there's a reckoning.
That's correct.
And there are issues like statute of limitations, but assuming that they haven't gone out, this isn't going to be the president forever. That's the idea of limits on the president's term. It'll expire. And so I think John and I have talked about the need for a truth commission coming clean about all the crimes that have happened, but I don't think that's incompatible and shouldn't be incompatible with the possibility of prosecution. So I think likely that's when we'll see them. I would have thought that, in the case, for instance, of, this is changing topics a little bit, but
Please.
when local laws are violated, say by ICE in the what are often abductions of local people, if there's
Yes.
violence, for instance, local prosecutors could bring those cases against federal officials. They don't have immunity. But I haven't seen a willingness of prosecutors to do that. So I think the realistic answer is it's the next administration.
Okay, we have another letter. This person didn't leave their name, but they say, love the pod. Regarding the Supreme Court hearing on conversion therapy, if their argument is that conversion therapy in Texas is a free speech issue, then cannot abortion providers in states with bans on counseling or referrals for abortion also use this argument to allow counseling and referrals?
It's a great question, and
It's
the
a great
courts
question.
looked into this. There's a case, for instance, called Russ versus Sullivan about gag rules. And the idea of a gag rule, often when you really look at it, is that they're not bans. They're financial incentives or bans on providers that receive federal funds from giving counseling about abortion. And what the court has said is there's a difference between an outright ban and the use of financial funds to limit what individuals, what groups can or can't be told. And so under the Russ versus Sullivan principle and the idea of there's a difference between government acting in its capability of banning things, prohibiting them, and incentivizing or disincentivizing them. And so that's, anyway, the court's argument for why there might be a difference here, why that might not be a free speech issue.
Exactly right. And the court's going to decide what they want to decide anyway. I mean, look at these stories we've covered this week, Professor. The mass shootings, government misinformation, deliberate church-state entanglement, racial bias in the courts for death penalty cases, democratic guardrails weakening or being deliberately dismantled. In times of fear, in times of grief, I want to ask you, Corey, what gives you hope right now, especially as a Brown University professor who teaches young people?
Well, thanks, John. I didn't want to not do the podcast despite the fact that there is so much going on right now at Brown, and the aftermath has been really horrible, frankly, in the sense of fear on the campus and the worry among my students. But I wanted to do it partly to talk about the fact and to give testimony about how much perseverance there is even in this horrific time, people coming together, thinking about what they can do, wanting to move on and persevere despite the horror of this moment. So it is a pleasure to speak to you every week, and although this has been a painful week, I thought it was important to talk about that. So I am seeing a lot of hope. I mean, these students, and I think, it's not just true of students at Brown, it's true all over the country. Young people have this resilience to them. And, I think, too, there's a sense, and this is what I'm most encouraged by, to try to think about, once we recover from the immediate aftereffects of the shock of this, how to fix things long term. Policy can do a lot to stop horror. Horror is not something that we have to live with.
Correct.
That's, I think, what we'll be talking about in the weeks to come.
Professor, I want to thank you so much for this episode. I know we ran a little long, but I'm glad we went as deep in everything as we could. I want to thank Wendy and Beowulf and everyone who helps us put this together. I want to thank the viewers, you deeply attractive people, for your support. Thanks to everybody for your very kind notes and comments to me about the unspeakable loss of Rob and Michelle Reiner. I loved them both very much, and they were both very good to me. And Corey, I just want to remind everyone, we read your mail on the air, so please, folks, send us your notes. If you have questions about constitutional law, Corey can give you smart answers, and I can give you goofy ones. And how can our listeners follow you, Professor, the other 6 days of the week?
Well, we have the Oath in the Office Substack, and we'll put links up to the articles that we mention every week, and that's growing, so check that out, the Oath in the Office Substack.
Right on.
You could also find it under my name, of course, Corey Brettschneider. I don't know if you listen to us on Apple, leave us a review. We have more than 450 five-star reviews, evidently, and we're very high up. If you listen to us on Spotify, do the same, or wherever you get your audio podcasts, leave us a review, and of course, subscribe. You can also find us on YouTube. And you should subscribe there. And most importantly, the way that we're growing so rapidly, I mean, frankly, we're at 20% a month we grow, which is a massive amount of growth, is by people telling people. So if you enjoy this podcast, tell your friends, send it to some friends, and it's a pleasure to join you here every week. If you want to send in questions, as we did today, we'll continue to take questions. You could write to me at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com, and we'll continue to answer them. And I just want to thank you too, John, for this amazing discussion as always.
Thank you, Professor.
Especially at such a dire time.
I do a show on SiriusXM Progress 5 nights a week, and we're also a free podcast. My book is out now called Separation of Church and Hate. It makes a great gift for the sane Christian in your life, or the sane anybody in your life dealing with a crazy right-wing Christian. And I want to thank you again, Professor. This was a hard week, and thank you for the intelligence and grace that you bring to all these discussions. We will see you all next week on The Oath in the Office.